Hello there, and welcome back to the last episode of my little Valheim series. In this video, we will see just how much I struggled to finally defeat the current last boss in Valheim, and as a newcomer to the game, just how difficult the final part of this journey turned out to be. Once the Queen was defeated, it was time to prepare for the long journey towards the bottom of the world and finally explore the Ashlands. Before we could do that though, I quickly needed to stock up on some of my resources to make sure I had enough materials to build portals along the way. Once that was done, it was finally time to go. For most of the journey south, I used my longship as my main boat. I heard that the next ship was slower and more difficult to navigate, so my plan was to travel as far south as possible with the longship and only switch to the bigger ship once I actually reached the bottom of the map. Now, I know a lot of people really enjoy the exploration side of Valheim, and normally you are supposed to discover the world naturally rather than clearing the fog from the map. And that's exactly what I've been doing through the entire playthrough. I didn't clear the map until I travelled pretty much all the way to the bottom of the world and back again. But by this point, travelling hard started to become a bit more of a hustle for me. It was incredibly easy to get pushed off from the course while sailing, and after doing these long journeys several times, it was starting to drag on a little. So once I finally reached my destination, I decided to enable cheats and clear the fog. It simply made travelling much easier, especially whenever I needed to sail one of the ships back home or travel somewhere I've already been before. Once I arrived near the bottom of the map, I found another stone tower and quickly turned into a temporary portal point. From there, it was time to collect all the materials I needed for the new ship and double check whether I missed any recipes along the way. Once everything was ready, I brought my longship back home. The only really fun thing that happened during the journey back was getting the "You are being hunted" event in the middle of the sea. Apparently, some events don't really care where you are in the world. They just decide it's your time. With everything finally prepared, it was time to head back into the Ashlands. And almost immediately, I managed to get in the way for the Bonemass. Eventually deal with it using my bow and sword, while also having to deal with some vultures attacking me on the way in. I have to admit, simply reaching the Ashlands felt like an achievement. Even sailing into the biome was difficult. On my first attempt, I only managed to reach a small island rather than the main landmass. But I have to give the new ship some credit. That thing is durable. It was getting smashed against rocks, attacked by a Bonemass, generally taking a beating. But somehow, it managed to get me through. Once I finally landed, it was testing time. The warriors, archers and witchers seemed fairly manageable at first, as long as there weren't too many of them attacking at the same time. So my first impression of the biome actually wasn't too bad. I was feeling fairly confident. Unfortunately, the Ashland had plenty more waiting for me. Since I'd only landed on a small part of the island, I eventually decided to head towards the larger landmass. That meant another short boat journey through all those spikes. Definitely not the nicest place to sail to. Eventually though, I reached a new area and immediately started building another base. At this point, I'd learned my lesson. Before doing anything else, I wanted a safe portal nearby so that if I died, I could actually get back. And that's when I started to realize just how different this place was going to be. For some reason, the smaller island felt much easier. Here, everything seemed to wanted me dead. If I hadn't built a moat around the tower, I probably would have died several more times. In fact, by the end of my time in the Ashlands, I think I died more time here than I had through the entire rest of the game combined. It was an enormous difficulty spike. I did get lucky a couple of times though. At one point I managed to get a Morgan stuck inside my moat, which gave me the perfect opportunity to finally kill it. But the biggest problem was simply the amount of enemies. It felt like there wasn't a single empty space anywhere. Every inch of the biome seemed to be covered with something that could kill me. Clearly, I needed a new plan. And that's when I decided, we are going full mage again. And this time, the skeletons were coming with me. That became the new strategy. And finally, things started to work. I managed to destroy the Twitcher spawners, and actually had a chance to deal with the regular enemies without constantly getting overwhelmed. Even the lava blobs stopped exploding in my face quite as often. Eventually, I found my first portrait hole, and honestly, I think the game was being unusually nice to me. There were supposed to be Morgans inside, but for some reason, they didn't really start spawning until I pretty much finished looting the place. For a moment, I even thought this would be not too bad place to live. Then everything started spawning. Suddenly, living there didn't seem like such a great idea after all. The next few hours were mostly spent killing enemies, exploring the area, and trying to figure out what I could unlock that would actually help me progress. The problem was that most of the regular enemies outside didn't really seem to drop anything particularly useful for progression. So I started looking into what I actually needed to do next. And one thing became very clear. I needed Flemethor. A lot of people suggested getting it from the fortresses. There was just one small problem. The first time I found one, it seemed completely impenetrable. You can't simply damage the main gate so easily, so I needed to figure out a way of getting inside. While I was still trying to work that out, I encountered my first fallen Valkyrie. The first one was a pretty tough fight, but after having to kill another two, I slowly started to realize that they weren't actually as difficult as I first thought. They also seemed to be really enjoying to fly away in the middle of the fight, which doesn't exactly make things quicker. Say, I could kill a Valkyrie now. Great, but I still didn't have Flammetal I needed. That meant it was time to start looking for those Flammetal veins sitting out in the middle of the lava. Eventually, I managed to find one that wasn't completely surrounded by lava and was sitting fairly close to the edge. Perfect, or at least that's what I thought. Once I started mining it, I got a bit of a surprise. The platform underneath the Flammetal behaves a little like a Leviathan. Once you start mining it, you don't exactly have forever before things start going wrong. Barely managed to collect anything before I had to get away. Thankfully though, I managed to grab just enough Flammetal to build what I actually needed, a battering ram. Now, we could finally get inside those fortresses. There was already one fortress close to where I placed my first portal, so I headed back there to see how this was going to work. Going to be honest, the first fortress was hard. To actually break through the gate, you need to stand there with the ram and keep hitting it, which means that the moment the gate finally breaks, everyone inside is basically waiting right in front of you, so naturally I had to run. It took quite a while, but slowly I managed to clear the enemies and finally take control over my first fortress. And after seeing how difficult the first one had been, I was already dreading having to do another. I also quickly learned something about my skeletons. They don't seem particularly interested in targeting the bow and archery, sitting on the top of the fortress walls, even when you're standing right next to it. I learned that with another death. Once the outside was finally under control, I still needed to get through the inner door. So I brought the battering ram over. Obviously, for some reason, it didn't want to fit through properly at first, because apparently getting through the first gate wasn't enough fun already. After a bit more messing around, I finally managed to get inside and break through the next door. And at last, we had our first proper fortress loot. I came away with 3 battle fragments and one of the green gems I need for the Stuff of the Wild. I heard that the Stuff of the Wild could make things a little easier in the Ashlands, so I was pretty happy with that. People say it's overpowered. Well, I still managed to die while using it, so clearly I was keeping things balanced. From that point onwards, the progression became fairly straightforward. Find fortresses, kill fortresses, collect battle fragments, collect flame metal, and repeat. There were 2 things during this process that became a little annoying. The first was the battering ram. You need a workbench nearby to place one down, but for some reason you can't simply dismantle it again using the workbench. And considering how much health the thing has, destroying it manually takes a good while. Then there was the catapult. I received the cog needed to build one from the first fortress, and I thought this might make dealing with the next fortress a little easier. From what I understood, once you set the catapult up properly and lock its legs into position, using groused ammunition should allow you to repeatedly hit roughly the same target. At least, that was the idea. My catapult apparently had other plans. Instead of consistently firing at the same place, mine decided it wanted to become a dancer and started firing all over the place. To be fair, it did kill some enemies, it did destroy some spawners, so it wasn't completely useless. But the fortress walls? Not so much. No matter how many times I tried to reposition it and get it firing where I wanted, I couldn't get it work consistently. Eventually, I gave up on that idea and went back to doing things the old-fashioned way. I jumped in with my hoe and dealt with it with myself. Slowly but surely, I managed to clear all fortresses I needed. By the end of it, I had all 9 battle fragments and enough flame metal to keep progressing. Then taking hour after hour of grinding. Finally, we were getting close to the boss. I just kept pushing forward and collecting everything I needed. And I have to admit, by this point, the Ashlands really wasn't much fun for me anymore. It was incredibly difficult just to reach the biome in the first place. Then came the massive difficulty spike once I actually arrived. And after all that effort, the rewards didn't always feel like they matched the amount of work I was putting in. For me, it started to feel less like an exploration and more like a chore. But there was one thing kept me going, and this was the last boss. I made it this far, and I wanted to finish this. So I kept going. Eventually, I managed to finish both armor sets I wanted. The grinding was finally done. The equipment was ready. And now, it was time to face Vader. With both armor sets finished, it was finally time to face the last boss. Crafted the 3 bells, headed towards the altar, and prepared to ring them to summon Vader. Before the fight, I watched a couple of videos to see what people were saying about him. And pretty much everyone seemed to agree on one thing. Vader was going to be a really difficult boss. At this point, I kinda expected that. After my experience with the Queen, I decided that this time I wouldn't even bother starting with the full physical build. Magic had worked much better for me and it felt like the safer option, so that was going to be my first choice against Vader. I still went in with a bit of hybrid setup though. I brought my bow along just in case I need some extra range damage. Once everything was ready, it was time to ring the bells, and Vader arrived. I have to say, compared to some of the previous bosses, this fight went much better than I expected. Most importantly, I didn't die. Considering what had happened with some of the last few bosses, that alone felt like a pretty big achievement. I'd seen a few tips about using magic against him, although I somehow managed to forget my throw staff. Even without it, though, the fight was going surprisingly well. Before summoning Vader, I also cleared the environment for better visibility. He's a pretty big boss, so I wanted to make sure I could actually see what was happening around me without the environment getting in the way. There were a couple of strange moments during the fight. A few times, Eikthyr seemed to decide that he didn't really want to fight me anymore. He would simply wander off, which meant I ended up running after the boss instead of the boss running after me. That was definitely a change from what I'd become used to. Even some of his meteor attacks seemed to land way off in the distance rather than anywhere near me. I'm not sure whether the roots were causing him to bug out, slightly, or whether something else was going on. Either way, it definitely made parts of the fight easier for me. Slowly but surely though, I kept dealing damage, his health kept dropping, and before I knew it, we'd been fighting for around 30 minutes. For the first attempt, I was pretty happy with that, especially considering how long some of the previous boss fights had taken me. Eventually, we reached those final few hits, just a little bit more, and finally, Eikthyr was defeated. The current last boss in Valheim was down, and somehow we managed to do it without dying once. After everything the Ashlands had put me through just to reach this point, that felt pretty good. There was only one thing left to do. Pick up the trophy, head back to the sacrificial stones, and hang the final trophy alongside all the others. And with that, I'll be finally done it. I've beaten every current boss in Valheim. Looking back at the whole journey, I had a lot of fun with the game. There were definitely parts that I enjoyed more than others. Some beams felt like they went incredibly quickly, while others felt much longer and more demanding. There were also a few parts of the game that, to me, felt like they could still use a little bit more work. And after playing through everything, I can definitely understand why Valheim has such a big modding community. There are plenty of quality of life changes that I can imagine making another playthrough feel very different. There were also entire parts of the game that I barely touched. Building is probably the biggest example. Outside of making the bases and structures I actually needed, I never really went too deep into the building system. The same goes for farming and food production. I grew what I needed, experimented with it a little, and then mostly moved on. So even after defeating every boss, there are still plenty of parts of Valheim that I haven't properly explored. All in all, it was a fun experience. I started this series as someone who haven't even made it to the first boss before, and now we've beaten the current final boss. Whenever the Deep North eventually arrives, I might come back and continue the journey. Maybe I'll even start a completely new world. Although if I do, I think I'd definitely be adding a few mods next time. Nothing crazy, just some basic quality of life changes to make certain parts of the journey a little smoother. But for now, thanks, and that's the end of my little Valheim adventure. Thank you very much for watching and for experiencing this journey with me, and I'll see you in the next one.